This is The Situation Room, the home of hard-hitting political commentary and penetrating insights about the state of the nation. This is a talk radio experience like no other. The Situation Room, a place for hard truths, debates, and elevated conversations. The Situation Room, witty, political, engaging, deep, controversial. In the room, we have C.T. Muga, researcher, academic, seasoned political observer, a fountain of wisdom in these politically uncertain times. Ndu Oko, Nigerian by birth, Kenyan by choice, communications expert, Pan-Africanist, a truth seeker and believer in people power, and Eric Latif, agent provocateur, the man in the chair, seasoned journalist, news hound, a man who believes in punching up, not down. This is The Situation Room, the only way to start your day.
2 minutes past 9 o'clock. Good morning, and how are you doing? This is The Situation Room, the only way to start your day. It's Kenya's biggest conversation, broadcasting in 94.4 Nairobi, Mombasa 87.9, 102.5 in Kisumu, 96.0 in Nakuru, 90.9 in Nyeri, 96.7 Eldoret, 97.7 in Malindi. Live streaming the show on www.spicefm.co.ke, as well as our social media platforms, Spice FM KE on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. We have a guest in the studio on the hot seat this morning, Nanjala Nyabola, writer, advocate, political analyst, author of a book that talks about looking at digital democracy and how far we are going, whether, and having all these technology things are actually entrenching democracy in our electoral system. Welcome, Nanjala.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
This technology thing,
Yes.
Are we in the right direction,
In general,
Yes.
it depends on how you define direction. I think one of the arguments that I make in my book is that technology reflects the values and the interests of the people who build it. And so the people who build it and the people who use it. And so, it's a mixed bag. There's a kind of a sense of a 2 steps forward, 2 steps back situation. We've had some really good developments in terms of opening up the public sphere. The fact that you guys are able to stream this conversation online, people are able to call in, people are able to tweet at you, opening up the public sphere in that way. We've had a couple of 2 steps back, opening up our political processes to manipulation and to opacity in a way that we can't even see what the manipulation is, and therefore it's difficult to hold people accountable for it. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag, and it's going to continue to reflect, I think, the ambiguity of our social and political system at the moment.
Well, let's jump into it. What is this manipulation you speak of?
I think overall, around the world, there's been a trend to introduce technology as a way of creating accountability in electoral processes. And it's important to note that even though I've written a book about Kenya, this is a global conversation. Last week we were talking about the Iowa caucus in the US because they introduced an app to manage that, and that app has turned out to make the caucusing, and caucusing is already a complicated process. It's turned out to make it even more opaque, even more difficult. So elections have become incredibly contested spaces, and they've become incredibly expensive and profit-making spaces. And one of the things is this tech solutionism is like, if we just throw tech at the problem, it can untangle some of the underlying structural issues. So it can make, for example, increased participation, it can increase that's the theory. It will increase transparency, it will help us make elections more accountable, etc. But the reality is turning out to be the opposite. If I go to a ballot, if I go to a polling station and I check someone's name off a piece of paper and I put it in a box, and you want to count those ballots, you take them out and you count them. It's very straightforward. But with a digital election, with an electronic election, what happens is all of our data goes into a platform, it goes into an app, it goes into software that we don't necessarily understand. And so like what you saw in Kenya, for example, in 2017, if you were following the courtroom processes, is that the judges didn't understand what the tech was doing. They didn't understand what the tech was doing. They were using and this is not, again, it's not a Kenyan problem. They were using analogies, they were using comparisons, they were bringing in, it's like if you do this and then you do that, it's like if you're in a football match and then you do this and then you do that. But that's not that's reasoning by analogy is not necessarily 100% clear that you understand that the algorithm is doing this, or that the IP that was that's owned by this company to build the software was doing that. And that's how you end up in a situation where we're told, the servers are in France and the people who build who have the data are asleep.
So are you essentially saying that even if people are participating using this technology, for example, that we see with a lot of new media and such, if they don't understand the processes behind all of this, that essentially then it is not democratic because they're not comprehending the process? Is that what you're saying?
I mean, to an extent, yes, because what you have to understand with tech is that the people who build it own it. And they are the ones who understand how it functions best. What you're essentially doing is you're putting all this data that was formerly, and again, you don't want to romanticize what was there before, because we've been voting here for 25 years. So we know in the longer system, we know that everything has its quirks and its ticks. But say, for example, a company builds you a software to run an election. They are the ones who understand exactly what happens in that software. They're the ones who understand, for example, how it goes from the polling station to the constituency level to the county level, and then to the NTSA, to the National Tallying Center, NTC. Those are the people who are able to understand how is it one vote that goes into the graphics, for example, that are distributed in the NTC. They're the ones who understand how to aggregate that data. They're the ones who understand how to translate that data into the output. And in an ideal world, all of that information would be transparent. India, for example, has open source protocols for its election, for a lot of its government related software platforms. So you can't use proprietary information to build a system that the government is going to use. It has to be something that anybody who, people can access the protocols. Anybody who wants to replicate that should be able to do that easily.
It sounds to me like we are really complicating something so as straightforward.
Well, this is the problem.
It's voting. 4 of us in this studio, we cast our ballot. Those are 4 votes.
That's
Can I replicate it?
The issue just goes up. I mean,
Why not?
Well, this is the issue that I bring up in the book. Is the problem with Kenya's election was a trust deficit. The problem with Kenya's election systems was always a trust deficit, that we didn't believe that the people who are counting were counting the right way. And I have this line in the book where I say, the Gambia voted out a 22-year-old dictatorship using marbles. You go to the polling station, you pick your bano, you put your bano in the drum. At the end, they count all the banos in the drum, and they say, oh, this guy has 22,000 banos. This guy has won the election.
Yeah.
The problems that we're trying to use technology to resolve, and it's not that linear. They're much more complicated conversations that we need to have about the trust that we have in institutions. The most important person in any election, unfortunately, is not even the person who votes. It's the person who counts the votes. So when we're trying to build all of these systems, are we actually addressing the trust deficit? Are we actually addressing the procedural issues? Are we actually addressing the transparency issues that have gone into building our electoral systems?
I hear you saying this. I was hoping you'd say integrity.
I mean, look, I try not to talk in cliches, because I think integrity has become a bit of a cliche in Kenya. We have Chapter 6. We have all of these...
Oh, no. I wasn't even going there.
No.
I was talking about the human element and the integrity that you anticipate and expect from the people who acquire the system that we speak of, the people who program the system that we speak of. The people who actually count it come last in that particular food chain, because all these things could have been primed so that the person who actually is involved in counting is just a cog in the wheel, and whether he counts or not, certain things could have been predetermined. I'm not saying that it's not important. I'm simply saying this. There's a human element in all these processes that cannot be ignored. And that's why I mentioned the idea of maybe integrity is overused and a little tired, but it has to come in.
I agree completely. And that's really, again, as I said, the core argument is you have to look at the values of the people who are building the systems and the values of the societies, the people who are using the systems.
I'm thinking that we are taking too much attention to the value of the people who are building the system. The system is as simple as that.
No.
It should be. Look.
You would think so.
You would wish so.
Let's look at what we were doing before we started saying, let's go electronic. You have a box, right? And you have ballots. You tick, you put it in this box. It is sealed. You and you break the seal, you count. It is that simple. Now, the next point is transmitting this same vote that you've counted here from this point to the next point. And that's where technology came in. That, let's shorten this distance. Let's make sure that the same box that was opened here has been resealed, arrives uncompromised. Now, technology means that you've just put it here,
Eric,
and then it transmits.
Reality.
So why are we talking about, this
what
thing,
you're
algorithm looking
saying,
at? What does algorithm need to look at? Whether Eric was actually a
by the
male
way,
human being, whether Eric
I
should have
actually
voted.
had
No,
brought in
Eric
algorithm,
voted.
and the system matrix hasn't come into this discussion. You are talking about the theory of these things. Reality of our voting system, ballot boxes have been found in rivers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Ballot boxes
Filled
have been,
with the blankets and-
yes, ballot boxes have been found in buildings where they shouldn't have been in the first place.
True.
Ballot boxes come stuffed. So these are the realities.
And that's why we remove that by saying, now let's have a very clear system here. Tick.
yeah, but
tick.
it's still a ballot box.
You put it, yes, but you tick and you put it onto this system. And what does this system do? It's basically just counting. 1, 2, 3,
That's
4,
where the
5.
integrity that I spoke of came
And
in,
1, 2, 3, 4,
because
5 moves from here, and it's being accessed by Nanjala on the other side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
in theory it ought to work, shouldn't
So
it?
the algorithm of saying it, I don't know what is this algorithm doing.
It's not
Looking
about
at 1, 2, 3, 4,
it's
5.
it's not about
Looking at
algorithms.
the
No, it
integrity
isn't.
of the system.
It's not
the
about-
person who built the system.
Yes.
It's simple. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
No, it isn't.
It actually isn't. So if you think about the Kenyan case, for example, you have to go back, first of all, to procurement. The law says that the people who build the system have to be procured through an open
tender.
that people have to submit their procurement. That actually didn't happen. It was a single source tender. And so that's already one thing that started the process of going wrong. Then from procurement, it raised questions. First, then from procurement, you go to actually building the system. As I said, in other countries, when a government is using data, using proprietary information means that all the information that's collected that is used to build a system belongs to that company. So, for example, our election data, right? If it's used, even if you say, I'm giving you 100,000 voter names from the registry so that you can design the system. Any information that person builds, unless there's very strong contracting around that issue, then belongs to that company. That's already a question mark, right? Why should information that we generate as citizens on behalf of our government to govern us be owned by a company, by a single company, and be used to build a platform that we don't have any kind of control over? Then comes the process of identification. Right? Because that was another point at which technology was introduced. And the whole idea of that was that we didn't want there to be shadow voting or ghost voting or whatever.
Yes.
Biometrics are based on, are predicated on a certain number of characteristics. For example, your fingerprints, your iris scan. In Kenya, we focused only on fingerprints. If you're a farmer and you've been farming for 31 years, odds are you don't have fingerprints. Like your hands have been rubbing on that djembe for so long that you actually have managed to rub off your fingerprints. If you're a woman who is accustomed to removing your pot from the fire with your bare hands,
them off, right?
You've burnt your fingerprints off. That's already a point that we have to address in terms of inclusion, in terms of creating representative systems. Like, it's not about, when we use the word algorithms as like a blanket statement, but the fact is it's bigger than that. Algorithms don't even come into this equation. What we're talking about is, are we building technology premised on making our societies more inclusive, more representative, more just? Or are we building technology in a way that it creates more obstacles between the citizen and their government? It reduces the accountability between the citizen and their government. And I go back to the Kenyan process again, because I watched that Supreme Court proceeding, like it was, the rich also cry. And one of the things that really, that's a veteran Twitter joke. But, one of the things that really comes across is, again, this lapse in accountability. When my election data, me as a voter, I give it to the IEBC, and you go into the courtroom and you say to me, we can't open the servers because the servers are in France and the people in France are asleep. That's a problem. That's an accountability problem.
That's
a government
issues.
problem.
Yes.
No,
but
it's not.
It's
absolutely not.
Look.
Because the fundamental issue.
Eric, why do you say
No. Let me wrap up my point. Let me wrap up my point. The fundamental issue is technology making our government better, or is it making it worse?
Is it?
And that's really that's really the question that I want people to grapple with in this question.
Do you present an attempt at a response
to that? I mean, from what you have written,
the book is available.
For what you've written and what you're, it's important. You're here with us.
No, I'm
no.
Bro, I'm
you're here with us. So in this case,
the book is good.
Yeah.
Do you have a copy with you?
No, I don't.
So answer the question.
In this case,
let me tell you where you can get it.
What is your perception? Because obviously you've written this to send it out to people with something in mind, right?
Yeah.
So what is it?
I am a political analyst. My job is not to give you the answers. My job is to make sure that we're starting from the right questions. And the right question, I think right now for me, what I did with this book was to bring the right questions back into the room. I think we started with the wrong questions. I think the wrong question was always, how can technology fix us as a society? And I think that's the wrong question.
What is the right question?
I think the right question is, what is wrong with the systems that we already have in place?
Trust.
Exactly. And if there's a trust deficit, can technology really address a trust deficit? No. How do we increase it? How do we address?
When you bring in other
how
issues,
do we
like
address
who's
the trust
the custodian of this
deficit?
data that I'm giving?
It's important.
That's the trust issue.
Yeah.
Trust and
If
the
you've given this issue to
manifestations
IBC and IBC has taken it to industrial area somewhere,
industrial area?
somewhere.
Yes.
I got derailed.
Okay.
Finish your question, City. I'll ask mine.
Trust, by its very definition, points to an outcome, a consequence. In the absence of certain things happening, you cannot talk about trust, and thereby you can also not talk about a trust deficit. I would have asked the question, what is it that brings about the mistrust, which you're referring to as a trust deficit? Before you get to mistrust, there's usually distrust. Okay? So what are the things that cause these things? Because it's like we are going to the end of this particular product and saying, this is the outcome. Okay, fine. That we understand.
What happened along the way
That
made
got us here.
arrive at that place?
That got us here because it wasn't always there, or if it was, it wasn't as prominent as it is now. Because with the deficit that you speak of, there is nothing that will be trusted. It doesn't really matter. The mistrust begins with the IEBC. Malawi right now having that same problem. They want the equivalent of the IEBC out. All right? We have a problem with our politicians. We have a problem with our government. So if we have a problem with these people and they're the ones responsible for the equipment that's supposed to help us understand, how far do you think we're going to go?
That's the question. That's precisely the question.
Thank you for going along with me. Now let me get you to where I was going, okay? When you say you do what it is that you do, surely you can't just ask a question and then not provide a possible way forward.
Why not?
Well, why shouldn't you?
Why should I?
If you're so good at analyzing a problem, it therefore means that you have an indication or you have an understanding
of a solution
of what could be done.
Absolutely.
I'm not using the word solution. What could be done?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we have this misconception about what the point of doing political analysis is. I'm not, and especially of knowledge making, and this is for me a broader philosophical a position that I take. We have this idea that they are custodians of knowledge, and their job is to sit in the ivory tower to disseminate knowledge down, and we, the lowly people, then absorb that and
where
I
did
try
we
to
lonely people come?
Exactly.
How did we come up with that idea?
Hang on.
If it wasn't passed on to us
chill
by this lofty.
chill.
Okay, I will.
So
Frost.
we have this idea. This is
Please.
the epistemological framework that we use, that the academy uses. That we have all of these handful of people who have the knowledge and they disseminate it down. But what I try to do is I try to break out of that mold. I think that ordinary people, I think people like myself, I think people on the street have the power to unpack issues, have the power to decide what kind of society they want to live in, to build that. And so my approach to things is always, look, I'm not going to tell you how to get to the promised land. That's something that we have to work out as a collective.
Yep.
My goal is to give you the tools to figure out what your place is in that journey. My goal is to give you an idea of where you start by starting to ask you the right questions. I don't think it's my job to fix Kenya. I don't think of myself, I don't think of myself, I don't have that sense of inflated ego where I believe that I am the only person who can point a roadmap to fix
You
this
can
country.
join the group of
Let's take
people
a break,
who
Siti.
think
Exactly.
that solutions are possible.
Exactly. By asking
City,
the
chill,
right question.
Nanjala, freeze.
Ice
Ndu,
frost.
are you ready? The conversation continues right here on Spice FM, broadcasting on 94.4 in Nairobi. Nanjala Nyabola, writer, advocate, political analyst, author of the book Digital Democracy, Analog Politics. And we're looking at where we are as a country, all right? And so you are explaining why you did not provide any solutions in your book. And of course, it makes sense that, you're raising the issues and the conversation that needs to happen. You're starting the conversation. But
That's
we're asking for your
contribution.
We are asking for your perspective. So
On
now,
what?
as we contribute to this discussion,
But on what specifically?
A possible solution
To what?
to the issues you've raised.
You see, this is exactly the challenge. The issues that I've raised are incredibly multifaceted. So if you're asking me what is the solution to fixing trust,
Not solution, possible solution.
yeah. If you're asking what is the solution or possible solution to fixing trust in a society, I think that we have to start by first of all, simplifying the way we understand the political processes, and especially giving the people the tools to understand what the point of political processes is. I think elections have become far too detached from people's social and economic reality. I think people tend to see election as a spectacle, as entertainment, and not necessarily as something that's going to have material consequences to their lives. So I would begin, again, by simplifying the way we talk about elections and by grounding it very much not in the personalities, not in the people who are running. So, and this for me starts from the front pages. For me, starts from the conversations, the way we talk about politics, the way we analyze. This is precisely why I keep going back to why the analyst cannot position themselves as the possessor of all of knowledge, but actually just as position yourself as part of this community. And starting from that level, it's not about the big personalities. It is, how does this process actually affect my material condition? How does it affect my economic condition? The way we've thought about transparency, the way we've thought about accountability with electoral processes, we think that it starts and stops with me standing in line for 3 hours. I cast my ballot and then I go home and
that's it.
That's it.
Your
my
duty is
done. But actually, if I go back to 2002. And I remember, for example, in Kajiado, where the voters voted and then the ballots were being transferred from the polling stations to the counting station. And it was a group of Morans who intercepted a box of a ballot box, and they opened it, and it was filled with clothes. It was on television. When I think about that whole scenario, I think about the role of the press in transmitting that story. I think about the role of those Morans in thinking, it's I need to know where this ballot box is going. I need to know that my vote is going to be counted. When I think about the conversations that came from that, that's the kind of accountability matrix that I want us to think about. When you have a tech-based election, it becomes hard to have that kind of accountability framework, because what do? Do I follow the iPad from my polling station all the way to the top? Like, how do I actually insert myself into that accountability matrix? Those are some of the questions that I think we have to think about. Where is the citizen in this tech-based election? Is our job just to vote and then go home and wait for the spectacle to play out? So, again, for me, it starts with shifting our conversation from voters as consumers of the political process to participants, as citizens, as people who are actually in this conversation. And where the tech problem comes in, as I've said, is precisely that. It creates this bigger distance between the citizen and the accountability problem. It becomes a conversation between experts. It becomes a conversation because what can I do? What can I do if what we saw, the one thing that we saw that I point out in the book that I think was really important, and a lot of people downplayed it, was the role of social media, of people going to the polling station, taking a picture of the results and saying the thing that's on RTS is not the thing that was posted at my polling station. Because what happened? You voted, and then it was put on that sheet, and then all the agents signed off and said, yeah, this is the correct tally. And then it was scanned and sent, but also it was
transmitted on the wall.
Posted on the wall.
Posted on the wall, yes.
People, that is accountability. That is citizens being in the process. That is people saying, hey, hang on a second. Kuna kitu hapa.
Yes.
So, but that Twitter is not built to do elections. Twitter is not an election function.
So
My methodological question is there for that. How do we formalize, how do we bring the citizen back into the conversation? This thing that happened informally, this thing that happened as a tangent, this thing that happened as unplanned. How do we bring that back into the conversation?
Can I answer a question for you now?
Sure.
You see, you have provided a solution, a possible solution. So it was possible all along. Was it
Me,
not?
I've asked the question.
The question has come at the end of it, and you've explained it well. The BBI seeks to do, among other things, present a parliamentary system of government. Probably the Westminster kind, probably a variation of it, but there's been that suggestion. And it's against this backdrop of our elections are the way they are is because we have had for the longest time an imperial presidency, and even with the current constitution, the competition for the position of presidency is what brings about all this mess that we see. Now, if the focus was on parliamentary votes, because it's parliamentary superiority that would then give you a prime minister, would we then at least allay some of these issues or reduce some of the temperatures that we see in our elections?
I think it doesn't matter. If at the point we are talking about the electoral system itself, voting and accounting for that vote.
Accountability of those votes.
But
So
Eric,
it doesn't matter whether you're voting for an
it does.
MCA or for an MP. It's not about the presidential that
it
has
does.
an issue.
Eric, it does.
How?
The fight for the presidency is what engineers, is what brings about everything we're discussing here. Because the prize, when one gets it, is considered to be so big in this country that people will do anything to try and ensure that they get it.
No, on a global scale, yes, because it's
No, I'm talking about Kenya, not global.
Yes,
Kenyan.
I'm saying globally, Kenya on a
All
bigger
round,
scale,
right.
on an all-round scale, that is what appears to be the bigger thing. But go to the people who are contesting for MCA position, for MP position, for woman rep position. In each of those 6 ballots, there's an issue. And the issue is trust. Have I cast this ballot? Have I voted for the right person? Has my vote been tampered with?
The problem begins further up, Eric. It's not downstream. Downstream is a reflection of what happens up there.
No.
Do you really imagine, this thing, the correctness isn't going to be determined by how loud you say the word no.
Yes, and
So-
you are stating it like it's a fact, and I'm saying I am also stating mine like it's a fact.
No.
It's not that yours is a fact, City.
No, it
way.
isn't that mine
And I
is-
am saying that just because you're saying that because
you are saying it louder,
presidential-
it doesn't also
you're
make it truer.
You're saying it's slower. It doesn't mean that because you're saying it's slower, it's truer. Look, you are saying that at the top level, and I'm saying
If
it's
you had
true.
allowed me to explain why I'm saying
It's
what
true.
I'm
There's
saying,
an issue at
perhaps.
the national level, but also let's also accept that it's with the system itself.
Are you aware
It's
that
the
I have not,
electoral voting
I have not
system
contradicted
itself.
what you're saying?
City, go.
I haven't actually contradicted what you're saying, but you seem determined that what I'm saying doesn't seem to make sense because today I've chosen to speak slowly. So let me speak loudly, okay?
And faster.
Voila.
And faster,
Okay.
okay? If you look at any electoral system, there is a prize that people are racing towards. There is something that they hope to gain. In our system, everything that we talk about has been for the longest time embedded in the presidency or the president or the post of the president. We talk about devolution and we talk about governors, but they take their cue from what we have for the longest time considered as the presidency. More or less an imperial position that cannot be questioned. And I'm saying the cue then, when you go downstream, follows from this. If I think I'm supporting a political party and I support the leader, I am assuming that the goodies I anticipate, if my person gets it, will be A, B, C, D. So I marshal all the resources I have to push and propel myself in this direction. That's what determines it. Do you really think, for instance, the numbers of people we have vying for seats of MCAs would be what it is if it hadn't been seen with clarity that when you're an MCA, you are entitled at some point to some grant, you can do the other. And at the same time, you can be corrupt. At the same time, you can have contracts and projects allocated to you. They wouldn't bother. People quit jobs to become MCAs because there's profit at the end of it. And where do they take the cue from? The very top. That really was my position.
I think the MCA position should be voluntary, but that's another story. I do think that the MCA position should be voluntary. They shouldn't be getting a salary. They shouldn't have budgets. They shouldn't have anything. I think it should be voluntary. If you want to be in government,
It's another conversation
leadership,
altogether.
do it.
Let's
Yeah.
continue the conversation at 29 minutes to 10 o'clock. So, CT Muga, I'll come and counter that in saying that, just because if we move from an imperial presidency and go into a parliamentary system, will that allay fears? That's what you had asked. And I'm telling you, no, it will not allay any fears. Because the thing is, you are voting.
Or even if we're looking at
Whether
then
you-
increasing or decreasing the amount of trust in the system, because at the end of the day, that's the crux of the matter, to say whatever system is used, it really then wouldn't really matter. Because if you've mistrusted it from the very beginning, whether a new one was brought today, tomorrow, you're still going to have a level of mistrust as a result of the things that have happened historically.
Yep. And Nanjala Nyabola, who's in the studio, of course, is coming out strongly as an anti-technology campaigner.
No, not even. Not even.
No.
Maybe
No, actually, no.
Not even a little bit.
I thought you. from
Just to
what I'm
clarify. So what is the cause for the distrust and mistrust of our electoral system? What is it? What is it that makes everybody feel, well, not everybody, but the majority of the people who feel that there's something wrong?
The electoral
You introduce a new technology, there are questions that are going to emerge. And the questions are not emerging because they're emerging because of a trust. Why was this thing single sourced? Does it mean that there's foul play here?
somebody wants to manipulate it
Yes,
and then use it for their own
is it-
selfish gains.
Who owns the
there is.
technology?
Usually
Is
there
there
is.
foul play here?
I think that
Who's custodian of the data? Is there foul play here?
I think that an important part of this question is sequencing, and sequencing where the mistrust started. And I think that it's very easy now, in retrospect, to miss that the mistrust wasn't always there. In 2017, we were having the first, we had piloted a couple of things in 2013, but we were having the first full digital process in 2017. The mistrust wasn't always there. That people were actually ready. People gave this new system a fair shot and said, you know what, let's see if it works. And the mistrust doesn't, it starts off, as I said, from did the procurement go according to the plans? Did the announcement of the results, come according to plan? The person who was in charge of overseeing the system shows up dead 3 weeks before the election. That's going to make people mistrust the process. The people didn't come off just from the beginning and say, well, we reject this thing and send it back. We don't want it because it's inherently bad. And this is why I keep going back to look at the way in which, look at the people, look at the society, look at the context in which the technology was deployed to understand why the mistrust happened in the first place. It was the context in which the technology was rolled out, was deployed, that started to raise questions. Not necessarily.
The issue that I see, though, is that we start raising the questions at the end. Procurement happens, there are no questions, not as loudly as you see them later. And then people are told, come, let's register as voters. You turn up, you go and register as voters, you give out your biometric information. You're not asking at this point who's going to hold this information. You're okay with that. You go and vote, the gadget is working, you participate, you pick your paper, you put it in the box, it's counted. Okay with that. Transmission starts happening, you're okay with that at some point, and then all those questions that you've been having at the back of your mind start emerging.
But again, to me, this comes back to a broader issue about participation and citizen participation. And one thing that we've seen, especially over the last 7 years, is that the state does not take the job or the process of public participation seriously enough. It is for bureaucrats. It is for the people who forget the politicians and the noisemakers at the top. It is for the bureaucrats in government to make sure to facilitate that public participation.
How do we
So,
do-
for example, when we're having a law about procurement being passed, or new regulations about procurement being passed, it is up to the bureaucrats. The IEBC has offices in every county, at the very least. I think in many constituencies, but definitely in every county. I know that in some places the public participation happened to a much greater extent than it did in others. That there are people, the IABC bureaucrats, the people, the unseen faces who went down up to the village level and sat down with people and said, this is what we're doing that's new, this is why we need you to participate. But the voter education, for example, didn't start until the very end, right? That is a failure of public participation. That is a failure of bringing people along to the process of governance. And again, to me, this goes back to a broader question of, if we had simpler processes, would it be easier to communicate those to the ordinary people and to get those ordinary people to participate much more effectively in the in the building of the systems, in the building of the electoral systems? And again, that's a much broader procedural question, but it's something to think about. Like, because if we spent 6 weeks trying to explain the 6-piece voting system, and still in the end it didn't quite land the way it was supposed to, because there were places where people didn't think that they needed to vote for a president, that they already voted for a guy at MCA. Why am I voting again? Are people missing the broader, bigger question of, okay, actually, it's not, I don't just need you on August 8th. I need you from, 2015 when I'm passing the procurement, you as a citizen, from when I'm thinking about procurement, when I'm thinking about IBC regulations, I need you to come to a public forum and sit under this tree and help me figure out the best way to source the system for you. And that's a bureaucratic question. That's a civil servant question. That's a procedural question that has everything to do with the way in which we don't do public participation in this country.
I think we can keep asking questions, but at this point it's very clear that we need to land this plane and say, obviously there's something wrong, right? And say then now moving from there's certain things or suggestions that can be made in terms of what needs to be done. Otherwise, I think we run the risk of continually asking questions and then saying, okay, because there's some people who need to be led. There are very many people who need to be led and will not ask themselves this question. They will even participate, but they will ask at the point that something goes wrong, or that they have the perception that something has gone wrong. But at that point is when they will ask.
And what they're seeking is assurance.
At that point, or even an answer in terms of, okay, if we did it wrong previously, what then do we need to do it right? And I think I do agree that there needs to be a collective answer, but some of those things need to start being thrown into the ring.
You're asking how the government can remedy the feeling of betrayal
over the people
and abandonment, because that's what happens when you prolong mistrust. Remember, we're talking about doubting, general doubting. We haven't gotten the position where there's a complete absence of trust. Okay? If this is prolonged, that's when you have anxiety. That's when you have, at the complete end,
suspicion,
self-doubt. Now, you asked what happens. The process of elections contribute to something. It gives us political leaders. And what these political leaders do bring about what you have referred to as mistrust, because of the broken promises. And you actually get the impression that the one thing you can rely on from politicians is to break their promise. It's like the guarantee that you have.
If I may, another election that happened that was quite interesting. I look at elections all over the world for various reasons. And another election in the region that happened that was quite interesting was the Democratic Republic of Congo, because this was supposed to be the first major election, again, major political transition. This guy has been in power for so long, it looked like he wasn't going to leave. And you look at how they process the idea of accountability. The biggest election observation mission in the DRC was run by the Catholic Church, because they have the biggest network in the country. So they have parishes, they have people who are able to volunteer their time to go down and verify results and things like that. They had a parallel tallying system. They had before the election commission in the DRC announced the results, they had already assembled all of these results. And they said, you know what, because we are an institution that has public trust, because we're an institution that people come to every week and they believe and they participate, we're going to run this process completely not free of charge, but completely voluntarily. And we're going to hold on to these results as leverage on the electoral commission, on the government, and say, you know what, we're not going to announce our results. We're going to give you the first swing. To do it properly, to do it in an accountable way, in a transparent way. And then if that doesn't go correctly, then we'll release our results. What ended up happening is that the government switched off the internet for almost 2 weeks.
And the Catholic Church hasn't considered this, had they?
Cut it off at the knees. Now, when you look at what happened in the DRC and you look at what happened in Kenya, what are the stories that emerge? One is, where was Kenyan civil society? Because the church is part of civic society. The mosques are part of civic society. They're part of everything that happens outside government.
Yes.
Where was the civil society during our election? Where was the observation mission? The observation mission told us everything is fine. Mm-hmm. Everything's gone great. What are you guys complaining about? Because the standard for elections in Africa is not free, fair, transparent. What's in our constitution? The standards that foreigners have for elections in Africa is: did anybody die?
There was no conflict.
It's a much lower. It's a
much
much
lower
lower
standard.
standard.
Absolutely.
No one died.
Because
Nobody
it's
died.
Africans.
Yeah.
Yes.
There was no kind of gunfire.
Okay.
Gunfire. It is all
It's
right.
okay.
Right.
You see, that's another question that that's another thing that needs to be put on the table. What happens again when we compare these two results? The process in the DRC, they tried to do a bit of tech, but fundamentally the process was get people out, get people to vote, get people to go home safely. There was a big procedural issue with Eastern Congo, which again reminds me of what happened in northeastern Kenya, because in Eastern Congo, it's worse. There's conflict, there's outright conflict. People were in entire big provinces were unable to come out and vote. Look at what happened in northeastern Kenya. There were no election observers in northeastern. In the 57% of the Kenya's landmass is Turkana, Marsabit, Wajir, Mandera, Garissa. They were no international election observers in any of those counties. None. Right? The only people who were there, who were on the ground, Nisisi, the civic society, the local observers, right, through their networks. So when I looked at the parallels between the DRC election and the Kenya election, what I thought was we had our election, once you put together the tech and everything, ended up costing us $28 per head. It was the most expensive election. Up to that point, it was the most expensive election in the world, right? Did we get value for money? Could there have been a simpler way of doing this? Are there things that could have done to address trust that was cheaper, simpler, much more effective? For example, the way they use the church systems that could have addressed some of these questions so that we could have at least saved $6 per head on the back end, right? Is there a way that citizens could have, because I'm thinking about groups like Lucha RDC, I'm thinking about, citizen mobilization that happened to go and escort people. I was an election volunteer in the 2012 US election. People get escorted to make sure that their ballots go into the box, right? Are there these other things that could have been done to address this trust deficit that didn't necessarily say we're abdicating any intellectual labor and we're throwing it on the tech? We're abdicating any philosophical labor about thinking about our society and throwing it on the tech. Please.
Our election has never had a problem with what you're discussing. The actual process of voting, people vote.
I would disagree.
No.
Mombasa 1997, Molo 1992, Trans Nzoia 1992, Mombasa again in 2007. When people instigate violence to disrupt voting,
they're interrupting the
vote.
Yes, they are. They are. When there's mass movement of people because of those disruptions, they are. But in the absence of that sort of disruption, which is deliberately engineered, do we actually just go and vote?
Do people come out to vote?
But that's exactly what I'm talking. In the DRC, in the Eastern Congo, we had an uptick in violence precisely around the election, precisely because this is an opposition stronghold, to get people not to go to the ballot box. This is a strategy that has been deployed not just in Congo, but here, since 1992, 1997, 2007, the whole strategy of starting election violence, of ethnic conflict, violence, of paying people to go and intimidate people. That is precisely what it does.
2007, the problem erupted after
the election.
That is a common.
No.
That is a common
result.
That is a common misperception. That is a common misperception.
In all Ngroni,
10 people were killed. 10 people were killed in. I want to say
in
because
it was in Masai land.
Yeah. So, the problem, 2007, what happened in 2007 between December 2007 and April 2008 was a culmination of a multi-year process that began with the referendum. Was a culmination of things that had been building up since that referendum didn't go the way the government wanted it to go. When we think about, then this is another broader, again, issue with the way we think about the start-stop way that we think about politics in Kenya. So we've divided the last 25 years into multiple eras. We have the 1992 to 97 era, we have the 2002 era, we have the 2005 to 2007 era, then we have the post-2007 era.
What was the 2002 era?
The good election, quote unquote, the one that went, people voted and more left and we were all happy.
How many electoral cycles have we had in this country?
Since 1990, we've had 5.
And how many have been marred by violence and movement of people?
4.
So
92, 97,
yes,
2007, 2017, and 2013 to a less extent.
So we're saying the vast majority of our voting processes people have actually voted. I'm not talking about everything that surrounds it. I'm talking about people actually going to vote. Let me explain why I'm pointing this out.
Please.
Because there are people who will claim, if I leave the violence, that even the process of actually taking people to vote, that in itself is interfered with. Yes, violence does that on a larger scale.
But can I tell you, I'm gonna rebut that with two propositions.
Yes.
One is, we cannot ignore that violence if the nexus between the violence and is overlaps directly with the election. If the reason why violence is being instigated is to disrupt the election, then the violence is part of
Yes,
that
right.
process. So we
I
can't
agree.
disaggregate those two things. They're completely connected. But the second proposition I would put on the table is the feminist one, which is, how do women experience political processes in Kenya? Can 51% of this population, everyone, confidently say that they're able to wake up in the morning on voting day, get dressed, and go to the ballot box and cast their vote freely? Because that is part of the conversation. The fact that in a lot of the parts of this country that there was this, you have this thing when you register to vote, there's that box that you tick where you say, I need assistance and I need someone to come into the ballot box with me. Many of the people who are ticking that box are women who have been disadvantaged, for example, from having access to education, whatever, and their husbands go into the polling station with them and cast their ballot with them. That's also part of the conversation. That's also part of disrupting the way in which people vote.
So if you want to actually take this discussion to its nth, then why don't we start with the nominations of political parties as to who is actually going to represent these parties? Because the very thing you are discussing is also evidenced when political parties have their nominations or elections or whatever it is they call
The
it.
entire process,
We're being
basically.
played out, but the music is playing us out. But I would definitely like to answer that
The
question.
entire process. It's 11 minutes to
Oh,
10
that's time.
o'clock.
Yeah.
The conversation continues, of course. We have Nanjala Nyabola, who's a writer and a political analyst, is in the studio. We're discussing our electoral system.
I was going to say I agree with you completely. I think one of this start-stop way in which we analyze and think about our political process is definitely part of the problem. Nominations are part of the problem, but we are conditioned to start thinking about elections from the week before the election or for 2 weeks before the election, when really much of the mischief happens at the nominations phase, happens within the party. And to go back to the word that you put into the table, the integrity of our political parties and the way in which our political parties understand the primaries and the process of primaries and what it is that they're doing this for. From a philosophical point of view, one thing that I always try to do is look at political processes from the perspective of the people who have the least power in them, from the people who have the least ability to influence outcomes. So I think about, how do women experience nominations processes in Kenya? How do people with disabilities experience nomination processes in Kenya? And that will give you an indication of everything that goes wrong with our nomination processes. You could be a woman, you could be the best candidate, you could have had everything go according to plan. And then you get to your political party headquarters and they tell you your certificate was taken by someone else. You could be a disabled person and have the best ideas and have the best networks, everything. And then you get to your nomination phase and you're not even able to participate because the materials are not designed to include you in the process. So I absolutely agree. We have to start, if we're going to think completely and holistically about fixing the way we do elections, we have to start with the political parties. We have to start with the primaries. We have to start with the nomination process.
So
It
the
seems to
political
me that
class.
it seems to me that that's exactly, I was going to go to the political class, and since it's clear that they cannot be involved in this process.
No, political leadership
Political
class,
leaders,
because
right.
voters, thugs, hoodlums, those are part of the political
Right.
yes.
But the leadership cannot be involved in this process, because if anything, we understand very clearly that information is power. And then at this point, if you know that you're putting the power back in the hands of the people, you don't want that process. So it seems to me, for talking about the clamor and agitation for some kind of change, for political participation, for education and things like that, for people to actually know this system or process that they're getting involved in, can we really involve the people who are manipulating it at that point?
Well, I'm sort of divided between my pragmatic side and my philosophical side. On my philosophical side, I want us to get to the point where we say we are running these things for ourselves. I don't need the stamp of authority from so-and-so from his residence in Karen or so-and-so from his residence in Muthaiga, that I'm actually part of this political process for myself. At the pragmatic level, I get stuck because I think we our political discourse hasn't gotten to the point where people are able to detach completely from power in that way. And I'll give you just a very easy sort of day-to-day example. When you have a funeral, can you fathom having a funeral in this country and saying local politicians so you're not invited?
I can fathom it.
See, I can because I can it because for me it's like
Not only fathom, it's not invited, but you will not be allowed to speak.
You'll not be exactly.
Yeah.
It's like for me, I would want that.
I can see that happening.
But you know,
Yeah.
I
have seen it happen.
You remember when the lady told the local politician? I don't remember this clip. I saw this clip going around. Went up and told the politician to finish
Yeah.
because we want to go home. And then what? But what was the caption that was shared? Rudely interrupts politician. You see, there's something like, again, the pragmatic side of me is like, okay, but who are we
without them?
I think we should. I have this problem a lot in the organizing work that I do. I say, let's just do it by ourselves. Let's organize ourselves, and then we do, and then on the day of, I'm told, oh, by the way, we invited MCA so and so. Oh, by the way, we invited MP so and so. Oh, by the way, we invited Minister so and so. And say why?
To give it some kind of weight.
To give it some kind. We wait. You know, there's a way in which we have understood the role of politicians in legitimizing our very existences that I think makes this idea of detaching power from the way we think about political processes a little bit difficult to comprehend in the short term. But in the long term, I definitely think this is something that we should be working towards.
In
I
a
think
very
that's
simple
where we
way.
need to, just stop inviting them to your things.
And I see that as our main problem. Where our trust starts beating us, it's because of that. Because we've elevated the politicians.
They are
to
the
that
be
level.
all and end all of everything.
They're
If
the
you look at that,
socialites.
and
They are
just
the
going by what CT was saying, just looking at
celebrities.
it without looking at it from the previous days prior to the election, on that election day, people get up, they trust that they're going to cast their ballot and their vote will count. People have faith in the system.
Yeah.
People walk back home, they have faith in the system until the politician starts making noise and telling you, look, our vote has been manipulated. The system has been manipulated. And that's when now we start thinking, oh my goodness, yes. And because we trust that politician at that point, we are agreeing with him. And whatever question the politician is asking, we are seeing it make sense at this point. Whereas before that, I trusted.
I would rebut that a little bit. I think we sort of end up at the same place, but we're on different journeys. Because I would say that, again, 79.1% of the electorate out of 19.2 million people showed up to stand in line for 3 hours on August 8th. When we did the November 2nd poll, the official results, which are also contested, brought that number to 38. So half the people who voted in August did not vote again in November. I go back to people's trust started to fray. I think people's trust in this new process started to fray the day Chris Musando showed up dead. I think that's when things started to fall apart.
Doubts were planted.
You know, because this is the person who, the day he went missing, was on television telling us, trust me. Trust my system. Trust this thing that I'm building. Here is how it's going to work. Don't worry. And then, 24 hours later, shows up dead. That is I think for me, that's where things started to go wrong. And to go back to the previous point, it should have started to go wrong much further back. It should have started with the procurement process. It should have started with the nominations process.
And when we say it should have started, is when questions should have started being asked.
But I think that again goes back to how we think about our place in public participation, how we receive and consume and process information about the way in which we're being governed. Is it a public information problem?
No.
Is it?
The no is, it's an amalgam of problems.
Exactly.
It isn't one thing. And also, we complain about our politicians, but we're also complicit in what they do. If we didn't, everything we've been saying wouldn't happen, because we actually support this process.
Yes.
On the one hand, we say they are the devil incarnate.
But then
on
we
the
ask
other
them
hand,
to come and give
we
way
also
legitimize
welcome them
things, yes.
and embrace them.
Active participants. Nanjala Nyabola, thank you very much for joining us. So you can tell us about the book and what you've said. What's the conclusion on the book?
Buy the book.
Buy the book. It's really good. I'm biased. I know the writer.
No.
No, it's it's a conversation about where we are as a country, but also I think it's a global conversation about where political processes are. What's the future of the election? What's the future of voting? What's the future of how our political processes are going to look. I wrote Kenya as a case study because Kenya has been the subject of my political analysis for a long period of time, but I think it's a global story that we have to start thinking more completely about what the role of politics is going to, what the role of technology, is going to be in our social and political lives. I think it's written in a very conversational manner. It's a conversation that I hope to start. As I said, I don't see myself as an ivory tower, thinker sort of, I've got the answers, here you go, absorb them. But I hope what it has done is it's triggered a process of asking the right questions about the future of this space.
Indeed. And well done on taking that initiative.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming, for joining us in this conversation. This situation room comes to an end for the week. See you. Today's Friday, right? Yes.
No, sorry.
See you next week on Monday. Today is Valentine's Day. This is what's going to be happening this afternoon on Spice FM. John, can you show that? Well, there you go. See that? That's Monique. Join her between 3 p.m. and 7 p.m. The Valentine's edition on Spice FM, Spice Drive. She'll be here, of course, and then the adults in the room will also be here with the adult stuff for Valentine's. Between now and then, some lovely music cruising through the golden years of the 80s and 90s. See you. Say goodbye.
Goodbye.
Everybody has said goodbye.